Imagine the sound, not the clang of swords or the whisper of a dagger in the dark, but a man's scream rising from a vat of boiling water, echoing off stone walls, tearing through the silence of a crowd that had come not to mourn but to watch. The smell of scorched flesh curling into the London air, the face of a man just a cook, contorted in pain so raw even the executioners flinched. This wasn't a battlefield, this wasn't war, this was justice. It was 1531. The King of England wasn't yet fat and gout-ridden, but he was already dangerous. Henry VIII was still young, still hungry for power, for control, for obedience. And someone somewhere in his realm had dared to poison a porridge bowl. Whether by malice or mistake, that act would awaken something in the king. Not rage, not sorrow, but opportunity. The cook's name was Richard Roos, and his death would become one of the most gruesome and deliberate spectacles of punishment ever carried out under the name of English law. You've heard of beheadings, you've heard of hangings, but being boiled alive, that wasn't a punishment, that was a message. And Henry made sure everyone received it. This isn't just the story of one man's horrifying death, it's the story of how fear was turned into law, how a monarch rewrote justice to fit his needs, and how boiling water became a tool not just to kill, but to control. Because when the law can be written in fire and steam, when pain becomes policy and the crowd applauds, what's really boiling isn't just the water, it's the soul of a kingdom. And it all started with a bowl of porridge. To understand why Richard Roos ended up in a boiling cauldron, you need to understand the world he lived in, a kingdom simmering with unrest, fear, and ambition. England in 1531 was not yet fully broken from the Church of Rome, but the cracks were spreading fast. Henry VIII, once hailed as a pious Renaissance monarch, had grown bitter. His obsession with securing a male heir and with Anne Boleyn was consuming him. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had become both a personal and political liability. But there was one major obstacle to his desires, the Catholic Church. Pope Clement VII refused to annul the king's marriage. And so Henry began a slow-motion rebellion against Rome, against the old laws, and eventually against anyone who stood in his way. This wasn't just a matter of love or legacy. It was a transformation of power. The Tudor state was morphing into something new, a machine built around one man's will. Parliament began to look less like a legislative body and more like a mirror reflecting the king's anger back into law. And in this tense atmosphere, religion wasn't just belief, it was politics. To support Catherine was to oppose Henry. To serve a bishop like John Fisher, one of Catherine's most loyal defenders, was to dance on the edge of treason. That's where Richard Roos lived. He wasn't a noble or a scholar or even a priest. He was a cook, a man whose hands smelled of broth and barley. But in Tudor England, even the lowest servant could become a political weapon or a scapegoat. So when a bowl of porridge poisoned 2 people in Bishop Fisher's household, it wasn't treated as a kitchen accident. It was treated as an act of war. And Henry needed to send a message. You have to remember, this was a time when kings were not simply rulers, but divine figures in the eyes of many. To poison a bishop's food in a household that opposed the king's marriage, that wasn't just a crime, it was heresy, treason, an attack on the sacred body politic. The kingdom was bubbling, and the first man to feel the burn would be a cook who may have just made a terrible mistake or walked into history's cruelest trap. It began with breakfast. On February 18, 1531, several people in Bishop John Fisher's household sat down to eat a simple, unremarkable dish porridge. For centuries, this meal had been a staple of English kitchens, hearty, warm, and safe. But on that day, it became a weapon. 2 people who ate the porridge died shortly after. One was a man named Bennet Kerwin, the other a poor woman who had been fed from the bishop's charity table. Bishop Fisher himself became violently ill, though he survived barely. The household erupted in panic. Was this food gone bad? Was it misprepared? Or was it something darker? Suspicion fell quickly on the man who had prepared the meal, Richard Roos. A cook, an employee, A man with no criminal past, no history of violence, just a job and bad timing. When questioned, Roos confessed, but not to murder. He claimed it was meant to be a prank. He had added something to the food, he said, but it wasn't poison, just a substance to cause discomfort, perhaps diarrhea. A foolish joke, not a death sentence. But in a Tudor kitchen, the line between joke and execution-worthy offense was razor thin. You have to remember, kitchens back then were politically dangerous places. The cook didn't just make the food, he held a kind of power. A whisper of powder, a drop of liquid, and the fate of a nobleman or a king could be sealed without a blade ever drawn. In Henry VIII's court, poisoning wasn't seen as ordinary murder. It was considered cowardly, foreign, and deeply un-English. It was the crime of women spies and enemies of the crown. And worse, Roos's alleged victim, Bishop Fisher, wasn't just any man. He was one of the king's loudest critics, a champion of Catherine of Aragon, a thorn in Henry's side. So whether Roos had meant to cause a stomachache or stage an assassination didn't matter anymore. He had cooked the porridge. People were dead. And the political winds demanded someone burn. And Henry, hungry to assert his control, desperate to show strength, seized this accident or this plot or this prank and turned it into a legal revolution. Because in just a few weeks, Richard Roos wouldn't be facing a courtroom. He'd be facing a cauldron. Would you like me to continue with part 4? Most criminals in Tudor England were hanged, drawn, quartered, or beheaded. These punishments were brutal, but they had precedent. They followed procedure. They lived, however twisted, within the rules. But for Richard Roos, Henry VIII didn't just want punishment. He wanted transformation. And so, for the first time in English history, the king didn't just apply the law. He wrote it. Instead of allowing Roos to be tried in a normal court, Henry pushed through a special act of Parliament. It was tailored explicitly and unapologetically to deal with one man. The act declared that poisoning was now high treason, a crime against the crown itself. And worse, it made the law retroactive, reaching backward in time to criminalize something that hadn't been treason when it was done. This was not just rare, it was unprecedented. Even in a world with no modern human rights, the concept of not punishing someone for something that wasn't illegal at the time was widely understood. But Henry wasn't looking for fairness. He was writing a message, one written in boiling water and sealed with screams. The act prescribed boiling alive as the sentence. It didn't specify how fast or how slow, how long the victim would suffer, or whether mercy would be allowed. It didn't need to. The method was the message. Poisoning had been done quietly, invisibly hidden in bowls and broths. So now punishment would be loud, public, and unmistakable. It was poetic justice Tudor style. To be clear, Roos was not the only person ever accused of poisoning. He wasn't the only servant to make a mistake in a noble household. But what made him different, fatally different, was the timing. He had tampered with food in the home of a bishop who stood directly in the path of the king's divorce. Whether it was truly a murder plot, a prank, or a terrible coincidence didn't matter anymore. Henry needed an example. Parliament gave him one. And just like that, the cook became a symbol. This wasn't justice as we know it. It wasn't about truth. It was about power, the power of a king to declare what a crime is, how it will be punished, and how many will gather to watch it happen. Next, they would build the fire, and London would come to see what royal vengeance looked like. Shall we continue with part 5? The square had seen its share of death burnings, hangings, and the brutal punishment of religious dissenters, but that day the crowd buzzed with a different kind of morbid anticipation. Word had spread like wildfire. The king himself had ordered a man to be boiled alive. They came by the hundreds. Merchants, fishwives, apprentices, nobles in fine hats. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Priests stood silently in the back. Even some court officials came not out of morbid curiosity, but to witness the execution of royal will in its rawest form. This was more than justice. This was theater. At the center of the square stood a massive cauldron, iron-bellied, filled with water, and already steaming from the fire stoked beneath it. There were no gallows, no axe, just heat and time and the king's wrath made manifest. Richard Roos was brought forth in chains. What went through his mind, no one knows. Was he remorseful, stubborn in denial? All we know is that he was a cook by trade, and now the instrument he had once used to serve was about to become the tool of his annihilation. There was no hood, no blindfold. This was no swift blow to the neck. The men assigned to the task used ropes or a pulley system. Some accounts differ to lower him slowly into the boiling cauldron, inch by inch. The steam hit first, scalding his face, his lungs. Then the water took over and the crowd heard the first screams. They were unforgettable. Chronicler Edward Hall wrote that Roos roared mighty loud, and those cries echoed through the market square, through stalls, through shops, through skin. The sound of a man being cooked alive isn't something even hardened executioners easily forget. The suffering went on for minutes, maybe longer. There was no priestly prayer to end it quickly, no swing of mercy, just the bubbling, the screaming, the horror, and then silence. When it was over, the crowd didn't cheer, they didn't laugh. Most just stood there stunned. Even in an age used to blood and brutality, this had crossed a line they didn't know existed until it was gone. The cauldron cooled, but its message stayed hot. Do not defy the king. Not in words, not in poison, not even in porridge. Would you like me to continue with part 6? What made Richard Roos's death even more chilling wasn't just how he died, it was why. This wasn't the act of a rogue king throwing a tantrum. It was calculated, legal, and frighteningly permanent. The Act of Boiling, passed by Parliament in 1531, didn't just sentence one cook to die in scalding water. It established boiling alive as an official punishment, specifically for the crime of poisoning. This wasn't some feverish one-off execution. It was law now codified in the books of the realm. And that law would claim others, including a woman named Margaret Davy in 1542 who met the same terrible fate. That's the most disturbing part Parliament didn't resist. The very body meant to check the king's power instead handed him more. In theory, Parliament represented the voice of the English people. In practice under Henry VIII, it had become an echo chamber for royal desire. And once that mechanism was in place, any personal fury could become national law, even the fury born from a bowl of porridge. Why poisoning? Because in the Tudor mind, it wasn't just a murder weapon, it was an attack on order. Poisoning was secretive, invisible. It bypassed strength, ignored honor, struck without warning. It terrified the public not only for what it did, but how it did it. A strong man could face his enemy in the field. A poisoned man never even saw death coming. To kill with poison was considered cowardly, feminine, foreign, and by extension, subversive. Henry's message through Roos's punishment was brutally clear: if you choose to kill in secret, your punishment will be public and grotesque. The very tools of the crime, a kitchen, a pot, a spoon, were turned into the stage for the punishment. The logic was twisted but airtight. A cook who killed with boiling food would be killed by boiling water. Symbol for symbol, heat for heat. But beneath the symbolism was something deeper: fear. Henry VIII was building a New England, one where the church bent to the crown, where Parliament wrote laws at his command, and where mercy was no longer a virtue, but a weakness. And in this New England, pain wasn't a side effect of justice. It was justice.